Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got into this situation. Welcome back to another one of these. I'm doing advanced tips today. I've gone across 20 different sources to find the most common advice given to advanced chess players. And in this video, I'm going to attempt to break it down in plain English. So if you're a chess player looking to improve, you are in the right place. Let's get started. I was surprised that the most common with 8 mentions is the Lucena position, which is of course the position on screen right now. But I guess I shouldn't be too surprised. When you get to the advanced level, you're going to get a lot more endgames, and a lot more equalish endgames as well. So a few things to note about the position. First of all, it is white to move. Second of all, white is completely boxed in. His king has no legal moves. And the question here is, how do we convert this into a win? After all, black can just keep moving their rook back and forth over and over. We're the one that has to make something happen here, and it is white to move. And the Lucena position is a draw if you don't know how to convert it. So the first thing we need to do is to play rook d1 check. First of all, if they move their king to c6, we can just step our king to the side and promote. That means all 3 of these squares are off limits for the black king. And no matter where they choose to go, you will notice they now cannot reach our queening square in time. You'll notice they are 1, 2, 3 turns away from our queening square now. And there's no point in getting opposition here, of course, because they can just keep delivering checks forever. So the second idea you need to know in the Lucena position, besides that check, is the idea of the endgame rook lift. This is known as building a bridge. Now, why in the world are we playing rook d4? Well, the answer should be pretty simple. Like I said before, we want to move our king out. That way we can finally promote this pawn, but they're just going to keep delivering infinite checks. So we need to block it somehow. We're going to play king c7, rook check. We step behind our pawn. They deliver another check. We go to c6, keeping an eye on our pawn. They deliver another check. Now king b5. Now finally they deliver a check on b1 and we can block it. They cannot make it with their king in time to stop our promotion, and that is how you win the Lucena position. So why is the Lucena position important to know? Well, I've been playing chess for a while. Let me tell you my interactions with the Lucena position. Occasionally, I'll be playing casual chess over the board at a coffee shop or something. I'll get to an endgame, and then one of us will be like, oh, it ends in like a Lucena, and the other will be like, oh yeah, good game. And I say that not to discount the importance of the Lucena position, but to say like a Lucena really is why this position is important to know. It's very unlikely you actually get this on the board, but the theme of avoiding infinite checks in games with rooks or queens is definitely a very prevalent one in chess. The first move of the combination shows us this theme of using the opponent's king to block checks. And then of course if they play the position a little bit more accurately, we get the theme of lifting up the rook. That way we can bring it in behind the pawn, covering the check to our king. And this is generally what like a Lucena means. Moving on to the next most common piece of advice given to advanced chess players, we have the Philidor position. So this is the Philidor position. It's sort of the cousin of the Lucena position, and it's very similar in the sense that if you know the Lucena position, it's a win. If you don't know it, you're going to get a draw. But the Philidor is sort of the opposite, where your opponent is playing for a win, but if you know the correct theoretical way to play the Philidor, you can hold the draw. The first move should be pretty self-explanatory. We're going to go rook a3. This is going to cut off our opponent's king, the same way they've done to us. After all, your opponent wants their king on the e3 square, and a lot of the time they'll start by delivering a check here, but you can literally just play waiting moves forever, just going back and forth. After all, with a king on f2, we have 2 attackers on e3, and the only other thing they can do really, besides delivering checks and moving that rook around aimlessly, is going to be attempting the pawn push. I guess they could try, king g4, but we can just keep blockading their pawn over and over and repeat moves this way. The point is they will eventually try to push the pawn, and it's here that we can play the brilliancy rook to a8, or a7 is probably fine. The idea behind this move is that with their pawn on e3, our king has opposition to it, and their rook is also on the second rank, so there's absolutely no way for them to block checks, regardless of what move they play. So they have 2 options: get infinitely checked, or try to block it with something. Hopefully this is looking pretty familiar to the Lucena position at this point. Say they try rook h5, no issue at all, we deliver the check, and if they block, we can trade down once again into a very simple theoretical endgame, where all we have to do is stay in front of their pawn, and if they step to the side, of course, we grab opposition. I think this one's a lot more self-explanatory than the Lucena position. I'd say the main takeaways here are the importance of cutting off your opponent's king, and also the importance of looking out for opportunities for infinite checks in endgames. And with that, the next most common piece of advice given to advanced players is triangulation. So first of all, what is triangulation? Well, it's just moving your king in a triangle. Pretty simple. And what is the goal of triangulation? Also very simple. It's wasting time. It's wasting a turn. The complicated part of triangulation is when is it actually useful? And the answer to that is going to be when you're trying to induce zugzwang, or a position where your opponent is compelled to move even though that will lose them the game, usually in an endgame, and usually when your opponent's king is a bit limited in where they can move, and your king has a lot more freedom like this. So here we can start with the move king e4, say they play king d8. Now we can go to d4, and you may notice there's an odd number of squares between our kings. This means we have distant opposition now. Let's quickly compare this to if we didn't triangulate and instead just played king d3 and then came back this way. Notice by wasting a turn, we were able to grab opposition, but without triangulation, we really haven't made that much progress. So back to our starting position, we're going to move back to e3, d8, king d4. Once again, we have our opposition. King e8, staying in front of our pawn, and now we can step forward. And should they play king e7, we have now compelled them to move, and this should be a very easy win for us. The next tip is to learn the principle of two weaknesses. Now, what is the principle of two weaknesses? The idea is that if you're in a position, like an endgame that's sort of drawish, the way to win is by creating more than one weakness, more than one thing you're threatening. So our first weakness should be very obvious. We're about to promote, and when we do promote, our opponent will have to take it with their knight. So that's one weakness. What's our other weakness? We have a light bishop, and our opponent only has a knight on the other side of the board. And the most important thing to look for when you have a bishop of a certain color in the endgame is what that bishop can target. After all, the weaknesses of bishops and endgames, and I guess in general, is that they can really only target their own color, right? So with that in mind, it should be obvious our weakness is this pawn here on h7. Now if it was black's turn, they would push h6, removing the weakness, getting their pawns on dark squares, and playing for a draw. But it's white to move. So we have the opportunity to play g5, as Naroditsky would say, deep freezing our opponent's pawn structure on their weak squares, where we can target them with our bishop. And then while our opponent's king is distracted, we can slowly maneuver our piece over and then win the pawn fairly easily this way. The next piece of advice is learning how to utilize a positional sacrifice. And I'm going to be very frank with you here. There are plenty of master level players who literally never play any kind of positional sacrifice or any sacrifice at all for compensation that isn't calculated and very concrete. After all, when you're trying to get good at chess, one of the most important skills to cultivate is a playstyle that allows you to consistently beat weaker players, and sacrificing pieces for unclear compensation can be very counterintuitive when you're trying to cultivate that kind of playstyle, but there is still a ton of value to learning these concepts. So with that in mind, I think the most important type of positional sacrifice is going to be an exchange sacrifice, that is sacrificing a rook for a minor piece. And there are players like Grandmaster Ben Feingold that will tell you that this isn't really a sacrifice. After all, you're losing one piece and they're losing one piece. The real difference between rooks and minor pieces comes in the endgame, when there's a lot more free space and you can put your rook behind a passed pawn. But regardless of how much stronger rooks are in endgame, it's going to be a lot easier holding an endgame where you're say up a pawn but down an exchange, but you at least still have a knight or something to blockade, compared to a position where you're just simply down a knight. So let's give an example of a positional exchange sacrifice. Say they play bishop to e3 here. And this is a very common type of exchange sacrifice, and my favorite opening, the Benoni, where we have fianchettoed our dark bishop, which means our dark bishop is by far our best minor piece. In fact, our opponent's goal with bishop e3 is likely to play queen d2 and then trade off our good bishop, which obviously isn't something we want. As well, they've also already moved their rook off of the f-file. The idea being, after we exchange sacrifice, we're not helping them by opening up their rook. In fact, we've moved their rook from an open file to being 2 squares behind a pawn. So if we do exchange sacrifice, and they capture back. So did we lose material? Yes, we sacrificed. But the positional compensation that we're getting from that is more than worth it. In my opinion, people don't exchange sacrifice nearly enough. I think they look for too much compensation. If you can name a couple things that are compensation for your exchange sacrifice, it's almost definitely the best move. For example, exchange sacking for a knight on f3 that opens up your opponent's king is a classic. Examples we showed here with making our opponent's pieces a lot worse. Other reasons you may want to exchange sacrifice would be completely ruining your opponent's pawn structure, winning a pawn or two, or otherwise compromising your opponent's king safety. It gets a little more complicated when we talk about sacrificing a full piece for positional compensation though. When it comes to sacrificing an entire piece for positional compensation, things obviously get a lot more complicated, and you're going to need a lot more compensation. If you've been following the channel for a while, this position should look very familiar to you. We are currently following Mark Esterman versus Justin Sarkar, and here we see a very thematic piece sacrifice in the Smith-Morra Gambit, the knight d5 sacrifice, but specifically one of the knight d5 sacrifices where we don't immediately win the piece back. So let's talk a little bit about what gives us positional compensation here. After all, we can't deliver a check and win a piece because they have d6. And there are a lot of answers to this, but the main one is we've compromised king safety. You may notice this diagonal and this file towards the king are looking very weak, and Esterman starts with a brilliant queen to d4, winning a second pawn for a sacrifice, also preventing an early bishop e7. If we just go a few more moves in, you'll see how quickly Black's king safety is being compromised here, and through one positional sacrifice, Esserman was able to score a win against a very strong player in only 16 moves, threatening a very cool checkmate. So we have a very clear example here of a very effective positional sacrifice. So the question we need to be asking ourselves is, how did Mark Esserman know to sacrifice his knight on d5 here? And the answer is, it's a very common theme in the Smith-Morra gambit, specifically in the Kahn and in the Paulson variation. To sacrifice your knight on d5, there's also a similar theme in the Shawinigan and the Open Sicilian. But on top of that, it also opens up the file in front of our opponent's king for an attack. They don't have to play d6 and open up this diagonal to their king, but it definitely is the most natural move. But even if they do find bishop d6, the compensation here is still fairly obvious, and even without a direct tactical reason, we can still sort of intuit and conclude that this is going to be a good sacrifice. So my rule for going for a positional sacrifice is I really don't think you should go for one unless it's a positional sacrifice that you've heard of. For example, the knight d5 sack in the Morra, the Shawinigan. I know there's theoretical knight sacks in the Winnower openings like the Staunton gambit, but obviously to a lesser extent. And my reasoning isn't that brilliant positional sacrifices won't come up in your games, or that you should like never go for it, but if you do attempt to go for a positional sacrifice, and you do end up losing that game, you almost definitely lost because of the positional sacrifice. On the other hand, exchange sacrificing for positional compensation, I think you should be giving those out like candy. And if you can name a couple things you're getting as compensation for the exchange, you might as well. The next most common tip is learning your pawn breaks, and learning how to use pawn breakthroughs in general. You usually do these at the end of the middle game or in the end game. Otherwise, a passed isolated pawn can certainly become a weakness. And while this position is obviously contrived and I just put it in, this particular pattern with a 3v3 will come up in your games occasionally, and it is important to know these types of theoretical pawn breakthroughs. This one in particular, you have to start with g5. They capture, you push f5, threatening to capture on g6, forcing them to capture you. Afterwards, h5 and we promote. The other side of the coin here would be learning how to prevent pawn breaks from your opponent, which honestly I think is equally as important. So say it's our turn and they just didn't find a tactic. How would we stop them from promoting a pawn? After all, we just saw the breakthrough. It starts g5 and then they promote on h8. Feel free to pause the video and think about it. It's going to be the exact same pattern starting with g5. This will allow us to put our opponent's pawns into a deep freeze. They either have the option of pushing or taking. Either way, the pawn structure is completely frozen down now. We have plenty of time to walk our king in. Pawn breaks are one of the most important things to think about when it's only kings and pawns on the board. Well, it doesn't really matter how many pawns you're sacrificing if in the end they can't stop you from queening. And the final piece of advice we'll be going over is going to be IQP strategy. So first of all, what is an isolated queen's pawn? It's your queen's pawn, and it has no pawns next to it to either side. Therefore, it is an isolated queen's pawn, abbreviated as IQP. First, let's talk about the IQP itself. Obviously, it's isolated, so it's going to be a target for attacks, but also it provides us with a lot. For example, it gives us a really nice outpost on e5 where they can't kick our knight without pushing f6. But on top of the pawn itself, the missing pawns are also very relevant. With no c or e pawn, this is going to open up our queen's light diagonal so we can put a queen on b3, creating a battery possibly. It also gives us an open file for a rook, as well as a semi-open file in front of our opponent's uncastled king. So what do you want to do when you find yourself with an IQP? Well, usually you want to attack your opponent. After all, you have these nice open files, you have plenty of open space for your bishops, you have a semi-open file in front of your opponent's king, and most importantly, you have an isolated queen's pawn, which becomes a weakness in the endgame. So with this in mind, how should you play against an isolated queen's pawn position? Well, you want an endgame. This means you want to be trading pieces off. You don't want to give your opponent a big attack, you want to get castled early, because an IQP position, once it fizzles out, is extremely easy to play against in the endgame. So you should be looking for moves that trade material, looking to get queens off the board. And maybe I'll get roasted for this, but I've always thought of IQPs as sort of like a half gambit. Like you're not going into an endgame a pawn down if they defend perfectly and trade everything off. But it is still significant enough where you're probably going to be drawing or losing. So to be clear, if you have an IQP, you want to attack, you don't want to trade material down, and you do not want the endgame. You want to take advantage of your open files and your strong bishops. If you don't have the IQP and your opponent does, you do want to trade material down. You're usually going to want queens off the board. You'll want to look out for tactics and combinations from your opponent. And most importantly, have fun.